and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing the Monster Study, an unethical study on orphan children in 1939. If you're like me and are interested in psychology, I'm sure you're aware of some unethical experiments that were done back in the day. There's a dark history to a lot of advancements in psychology, and we're all pretty aware of some unethical psychology experiments that have taken place. Most famous being the Milgram study and the Zimbardo prison experiment. Today though, I'm going to be talking about a lesser known experiment called the Monster Experiment or the Monster Study. The Monster Study was an experiment intended to test the effects of stigma on childhood stuttering, but mostly it resulted in a whole lot of trauma. In 1939, 22 children from a nearby orphanage, roughly half of whom who had a stutter, were brought to a team of psychologists at the University of Iowa, headed by Dr. Wendell Johnson, to see if labeling a child with a stutter versus a normal speaker made any difference in their speech development. They ended up making two groups. The first group was a group of stutterers and non-stutterers, and they were told speech was fine, and they were instructed to simply practice to overcome any difficulties and were praised for their efforts. The second group also had a mixture of children who had a stutter and children who did not have a stutter. They were chastised for their speech and told not to speak at all unless they were absolutely sure they could articulate properly. First group speech improved, or at least didn't get worse, but even those in the second group who previously had no stutter developed problematic speech patterns or simply stopped talking altogether. Some began to show signs of physical distress, such as covering their eyes, and their issues sometimes lasted years beyond the study's conclusion. Eventually, Johnson realized how unethical it was to subject orphans. I think it's unethical to subject anyone to this. He realized subjecting orphans to a psychological experiment they didn't even understand, let alone could consent to, especially as some of their problems worsened. Johnson eventually decided not to publish his results, but grad student Mary Tudor used the experiment as her doctoral thesis. When her work was published, she noted that she believed the damage to the children was significant, though she tried to reverse some of the complications with the follow-up care over the following years. Several decades later, the release of the book Ethics, a Case Study from Fluency, which highlighted the study's flaws, brought it once again to public attention. Some speech pathologists did find its ultimate conclusion to be useful, at least insofar as what not to do. But several of the subjects sued the state of Iowa over the study's lasting effects, and in 2007 they were awarded $1.2 million. Good for them. Well, that was a brief overview of the Monster Study, and it's sad that so many experiments had such unethical practices. At least nowadays we have learned from our mistakes, and in psychology and doing studies, it's very strict. I know in Canada at the universities, it's very strict when it comes to doing any kind of research. When I was doing my honors thesis for neuropsych, it's very strict, and my experiment was not something invasive. I was doing a study on the Simon effect, and I'd have participants come in and sit in a room at a desk for about an hour, and they were just clicking buttons. But even that, we had to make sure that the lighting wasn't going to hurt their eyes, that they wouldn't feel any physical discomfort, that they wouldn't be psychologically affected. And so we had to do something, well, every student has to do an REB before you do any kind of research at the university. So it's a research ethics board paperwork, and these are very like structured, and they're almost a little too limiting, which is good because we don't want anyone to suffer any consequences or mental anguish or physical harm or anything like that. But yeah, these forms are very, very strict. So you write it up and put any possible thing that could go wrong, and you submit it to the university, and usually they send it back with some things you need to change to make sure it's really ethical to put your participants through. So nowadays, I know in Canada at our universities, it's very strict when it comes to doing research, and everything is trying to be very ethical. So that is one positive out of all these terrible studies, is that we're trying to be more conscious and ethical and thinking of the participants and not just the results of the study. So at least, things are looking up. But thank you for joining me. That was just a short little synopsis on the study. Joining me. I hope you guys have a great day. Bye-bye.